All the Reverend Father carried that night was a hymnal book, the spoken word, and a simple wooden cross resting over his chest. He wasn't expecting conflict. He wasn't expecting fear. He wasn't expecting blood. But that's the thing about tragedies. They never knock before they enter. The church was quiet, wrapped in the soft glow of its evening candles. Dust floated in the air, drifting like tiny spirits across the stained glass reflection. The Reverend had just finished prayer when he saw him. Daniel. A man who never spoke loudly, never caused trouble, never skipped a Sunday. He looked different that evening. Restless, distracted, almost trembling. The Reverend approached him gently, as he always did when someone seemed burdened. And what happened next would turn the sanctuary into a battlefield. Because after a soft, honest attempt to comfort him, the Reverend said one sentence he thought would help. "Daniel, are you gay?" A question spoken with compassion, but heard as an accusation. A word meant to open a door, but instead shattered something buried deep inside the man standing before him. Daniel froze. His jaw clenched. His breath sharpened. And then, the hymnal book slipped from the Reverend's hand. As Daniel exploded, pews crashed. Candles toppled. The wooden cross on the Reverend's neck snapped against his chest as he was thrown to the floor. The church had become a war zone. The question now is, why? Why would a man go from silence to violence over a single word? Here are the cracks forming under the surface. Cracks no one noticed until it was too late. 1. The Reverend had noticed Daniel's pain. Not judgment, pain. He had seen Daniel withdraw from choir practice, leave early after Mass, avoid eye contact. Signs of a man wrestling something internal. 2. Daniel had come seeking guidance for a burden he couldn't name. His own words used in confession weeks earlier. A secret eating him alive. 3. The Reverend thought naming it would help him heal. He had counseled many before. He believed confronting truth was the path to peace. But Daniel didn't hear compassion that night. He heard exposure. He heard shame. He heard a life he'd spent hiding ripping open in front of him. 4. Daniel believed the Reverend was about to tell others. A fear that grew into panic. Panic that grew into anger. Anger that exploded into violence. And in seconds, the man who came seeking peace became the man who broke it. The Reverend, struggling to breathe on the sanctuary floor, whispered, "Daniel, why?" But Daniel didn't respond. His eyes were wild, glassy, confused, as if even he didn't know what he had just unleashed. This wasn't just an assault. This was a lifetime of suppressed identity colliding violently with a man who tried to reach into the darkness and name it. The question now is, was Daniel truly angry at the Reverend? Or was he finally breaking under the weight of the person he couldn't accept he was? And how does a man go from searching for help to nearly killing the only person who tried to give it? This was just the beginning. Before the assault, before the shattered pews, before the Reverend lay bleeding beneath the broken cross, there was Daniel, a man the community knew, but never truly saw. In every church there is one person who blends in so well. They almost disappear. Daniel was that person. He sat in the same back pew every Sunday, sang hymnals just softly enough to be heard but never enough to stand out, volunteered to clean the church steps after Mass, smiled politely when greeted, the perfect church member, or so everyone thought. But behind his quiet presence lived a storm he couldn't name. Daniel grew up in a home where every emotion was judged, measured, corrected, where boys were told to toughen up, and where the worst insult wasn't failure, it was weakness. His father, a rigid man carved from anger and expectations, believed that love was shown through discipline, not affection. And Daniel, well, he learned early that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, especially the truth about who he was. He was told that anything different was wrong, sinful, shameful. So he buried his feelings beneath layers of silence. He hid his identity like a wound that never healed. He carried shame like a second skin. To most people, entering a church provides comfort. For Daniel, it was camouflage. The choir, the candles, the sermons. They all offered structure, rules, order. Order that kept the chaos inside him from spilling out. He believed that if he prayed hard enough, sang loud enough, confessed long enough, he could erase the parts of himself he feared. The Reverend was one of the few who noticed the heaviness in Daniel's eyes. He saw the young man stay after Mass, sitting alone in the quiet, fingers tapping nervously on the pew. He saw someone hurting. And the Reverend's instinct was always the same. Help the wounded, heal the broken, name the pain so it loses its power. What he didn't know was that Daniel's pain didn't want a name, because naming it meant facing it. And Daniel wasn't ready. Not then. Not ever. Daniel lived in contradiction, a man trying to serve God while fighting the truth of who he was. Every time he saw two men holding hands, a piece of him ached. Every time he saw a sermon condemning same-sex love, a piece of him broke. He was raised to believe that God hated the part of him he couldn't shut off. That belief became poison. It turned guilt into sickness, sickness into anger, anger into fear, fear into a lifelong battle between who he was and who he pretended to be. And when you suppress something long enough, it doesn't disappear, it detonates. So when the Reverend finally asked, "Daniel, are you gay?" It wasn't just a question. It was a mirror he never wanted to look into, a truth he never wanted spoken aloud, a fear he thought he could bury forever. In that moment, Daniel didn't see the Reverend. He saw his father's voice calling him weak, his childhood pastor condemning people like him, his own reflection, terrifying and unfamiliar. His mind didn't hear compassion. It heard betrayal, exposure, judgment. The man of God he trusted most felt suddenly like the man who could destroy everything he had fought to hide. And in that fear, that raw, choking panic, something inside him snapped. Daniel wasn't a violent man. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't evil. He was broken. A lifetime of internal war, childhood shame, religious fear, and identity confusion, all collided in that sacred room. The moment the Reverend said the word, Daniel feared more than hell itself. That is the truth behind the attack. Not hatred, not rage, not malice, but a man finally cracking under the weight of who he was told he could never be. And now, with the church shattered and the Reverend injured, the world would soon discover that this story was never about a single moment, but about a lifetime of buried truth. And Daniel's breaking point was only the beginning. It started like any ordinary evening mass. Quiet, reverent, peaceful. But peace has a way of cracking when the truth inside someone becomes too loud to silence. That night, the Reverend walked into the sanctuary unaware that within the next hour, the house of God would turn into a battleground, and he would become its first casualty. Only a handful of candles flickered. The choir had gone home. The pews were silent. Daniel stayed behind, again. He sat alone in the second-to-last pew, hands trembling around a folded bulletin. The Reverend noticed. He always noticed. He approached with only three things: a hymnal book, the Word, and a cross hanging from his neck. Nothing else. No weapon. No guard. No fear. Just faith. The Reverend had spent weeks sensing something heavy in Daniel's spirit. A burden unspoken. A truth trying to claw its way out. But tonight, that truth was ready to erupt. The Reverend sat beside him. Not as a judge. Not as an authority. But as a father figure. Soft-spoken, gentle, concerned. "Daniel," he said quietly, "your heart has been hurting. You don't have to hide from God, or from me." Daniel stared at the floor, breathing hard. And the Reverend continued, "There is no shame in who you are. Daniel, are you gay?" Silence. Then, a sharp inhale. Then, the sound of something inside Daniel snapping, like a rope pulled too tight for too long. To the Reverend, it was a compassionate question. To Daniel, it felt like an exposure, a threat, an attack on the fragile identity he spent a lifetime burying. His hand tightened around the bulletin. His pulse thundered in his ears. He whispered, "You shouldn't have said that." Then everything went dark. Daniel rose from the pew, his breathing sharp and panicked. The Reverend stood slowly, holding out a calming hand. "Daniel, it's okay. But trauma does not hear reason. Shame does not hear love. Fear does not hear God." Daniel's eyes filled with rage, not at the Reverend, but at himself. And in that confusion, that emotional collapse, he lunged. He shoved the Reverend so hard that the man of God stumbled backward, slamming into a wooden pew. The cross around his neck swung violently, catching the candlelight. "Daniel, stop," the Reverend cried. But Daniel couldn't stop. He didn't even see the Reverend anymore. He saw his father's anger, his childhood pastor's sermons about damnation, every voice that told him he was broken. The Reverend reached for his hymnal, not to defend himself, but to calm Daniel with scripture. But to Daniel, the gesture looked like accusation. He knocked the hymnal from the Reverend's hand and pinned him to the altar rail. Pews scraped violently across the floor. The sound echoed like thunder, a place of worship, turning into a war zone. Daniel's hands trembled as he held the Reverend down. Tears streamed from his eyes. "You don't understand," he screamed. "You don't know what they did to me." You don't know what it cost me to hide, and you're trying to drag it out." The Reverend, gasping for breath, managed to say, "Daniel, I'm not dragging anything out. I'm trying to help you carry it." But Daniel was beyond the reach of kindness. He was drowning in years of spiritual fear and unmet truth. The Reverend tried to sit up, and that was when Daniel shoved him again, harder this time. The man of God's head struck the floor. The candle holders fell and clattered. The stained glass windows shivered. The wooden cross behind the altar swayed. And in that chaotic moment, one truth became undeniable. Daniel wasn't attacking the Reverend. He was attacking the part of himself he had been taught to hate. As the Reverend lay dazed, a silver crucifix slid from his pocket, hitting the floor between them. The tiny metal cross spun slowly, catching the moonlit glow through the stained glass. The sound, soft, metallic, sacred, cut through Daniel's rage. Like a whisper from heaven, he stared at it, chest heaving. His hands stopped shaking. His anger evaporated into horror. He looked at the Reverend's blood, at the overturned pews, at the destruction around him, and suddenly Daniel realized he had turned the sanctuary into a battlefield, to escape a truth he could no longer outrun. He collapsed to his knees beside the wounded Reverend, sobbing. "I didn't mean. Father, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." His voice cracked into childhood again, small, scared, pleading. The Reverend reached for Daniel's hand, whispering, "You are not your shame, and you are not lost." It was the last thing he said before losing consciousness. And just when Daniel thought it was over, just when silence reclaimed the sacred room, the church doors flew open. Flashlights, footsteps, voices. Someone had heard the crash. Someone had called for help. And now, police were storming in. Daniel froze. He wasn't ready to face them. He wasn't ready to face himself. And that was the moment, the single terrifying moment, when this story took its first unexpected twist. Because standing among the police officers was someone Daniel never imagined he would see again. Someone whose presence would shatter everything he thought he knew about that night. The police flooded into the church, boots pounding the wooden floors, radios crackling, flashlights slicing through the heavy shadows. But Daniel didn't see the lights. He didn't hear the orders being shouted. He saw one person, one figure standing just behind the officers, frozen, silent, eyes wide with disbelief. A person Daniel thought he would never see again, because he promised himself he never would. His older brother, Matthew. The same brother who kicked Daniel out of the house when their parents found out he was questioning his sexuality. The same brother who told him that God doesn't make mistakes, but you must be one. The same brother who watched Daniel break, and never looked back. And now, he was standing at the church entrance, in a police uniform. But he wasn't speaking. He wasn't moving. He was staring at Daniel. Not with hate, not with righteousness, but with something far more complicated. Fear, guilt, recognition. And Daniel felt a cold wave run through him. Why was Matthew here? Why tonight? Why now? "Hands where we can see them," one officer shouted. Daniel didn't move. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't run. He stared at Matthew, his voice barely above a whisper. You became a cop?" Matthew swallowed hard. His voice cracked. "Daniel, what did you do?" The officers were closing in. The Reverend lay unconscious on the floor. The church looked like a battlefield. And Daniel, blood on his hands, tears streaking his face, felt like the monster he had been told he was. But Matthew didn't draw his weapon. He didn't step forward. He stepped back. Because suddenly the truth wasn't as simple as it looked. This wasn't a criminal to arrest. This was his brother. One of the other officers grabbed Daniel's arm. "Daniel Pierce, you're under arrest for..." But Matthew cut him off harshly. "Wait, don't touch him." Everyone froze. The senior officer looked at Matthew, confused. "What are you doing?" "He assaulted a priest. We saw the scene. We need to..." I said wait. The church shook with his shout. Silence swallowed the room. And for the first time in years, Daniel saw something in Matthew's eyes that he had never seen before. Regret. Then Matthew said something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. Something no one expected, and something Daniel never knew. Words that turned this from a violent outburst into a mystery. "Before you arrest him, you need to hear what I saw earlier today." The officers looked at each other. Daniel's stomach dropped. Matthew stepped forward and whispered, "Father Elias has been hiding something." The room went still, because the Reverend lying unconscious on the floor The man everyone believed was the victim was suddenly no longer the only person under scrutiny. This wasn't just a case of assault. It was becoming something far more complicated and much darker. The officers exchanged tense glances. Father Elias, beloved leader, respected preacher, lay unconscious on the church floor, blood staining his collar. But now Matthew's words hung in the air like smoke. Father Elias has been hiding something. Daniel blinked, confused and terrified. Matthew wasn't a man who spoke lightly. Certainly not in uniform. Certainly not about a priest. So the senior officer turned to him slowly. What exactly did you see? Matthew took a long breath, his eyes flicking toward his brother, not with blame, but with warning. Because this wasn't just going to change the case. It was going to explode it. Matthew started carefully, his voice low. I've been responding to anonymous complaints about Father Elias for months. Nothing we could act on. No names. No solid evidence. Just patterns. Patterns? The sergeant pressed. Matthew nodded. He had late-night meetings with young male parishioners. Always one-on-one. Always behind locked doors. And every time someone tried to speak up, the person disappeared from the church community almost immediately. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. He remembered those meetings. Everyone did. Young men being mentored, guided spiritually, corrected. He had been one of them once, until he couldn't take it anymore. Matthew continued. Earlier today around noon, I saw Father Elias arguing with someone behind the church. A young guy I didn't recognize. The kid looked terrified. Kept saying, please don't do this again. Daniel's breath caught. Again. Matthew nodded grimly. Father Elias grabbed him by the arm. Hard. Enough to make the kid wince. I stepped out of the car to intervene, but the moment they saw me, the kid bolted. Ran like his life depended on it. The church felt colder now. Smaller. What did Elias do? Another officer asked. Matthew's jaw tightened. He just smiled. Walked past me and said, boys get confused, but God always uses me to correct them. Daniel's knees nearly buckled. He had heard that phrase before. Word for word. 10 years ago. In the confession room. When Father Elias told him he needed purification counseling. And suddenly, the insult, the accusation, the moment Daniel snapped, made a terrifying kind of sense. Daniel's voice shook as he whispered, he did that to me. The officers turned sharply. Daniel swallowed hard. When I was 16, he said I was broken. Said he could fix the confusion in me. Matthew finally met his brother's eyes. I know, he whispered. I read the old file. The complaint you filed. The one the church buried. Daniel stared at him, stunned. You knew? Matthew nodded slowly. And I should have come to you sooner. Matthew stepped closer to the officers. Daniel didn't attack him without reason. This wasn't random. This was years of trauma exploding in seconds. But that doesn't excuse the assault, the sergeant said. No, Matthew agreed. It doesn't. He looked down at Father Elias. But it does mean this crime scene is incomplete. The senior officer frowned. How so? Matthew glanced toward the front pew, toward the Reverend's bag lying on the floor, half unzipped. I saw Elias leaving a house tonight before coming here, Matthew said. A house we've had on watch before because... He stopped. The sergeant stepped closer. Because what? Matthew exhaled shakily. Because it's where one of the missing boys was last seen. The entire room froze. Daniel's heart slammed into his ribs. The officers looked at each other. Because suddenly, this wasn't just an assault investigation. This was the beginning of something darker. A pattern, a cover-up, a truth someone had buried for years. And the key to unlocking it might be lying right inside Father Elias's bag. The church was silent, eerily silent, except for the slow, rhythmic beeping of Father Elias's portable heart monitor. Officers stood frozen, waiting for the senior sergeant's command. Matthew didn't take his eyes off the worn black leather bag lying near the altar. It had spilled open slightly during the struggle, and what peeked from the inside made his stomach twist. Secure that bag, the sergeant finally ordered. An officer crouched down cautiously, as if expecting the thing to bite. He unzipped it fully, and the contents spilled out across the marble floor. Silence, then shock, then disbelief, laid out before them. A small digital camera, its screen cracked. Several USB drives, numbered with black marker. A stack of confidential church counseling files. A folded, stained handkerchief marked with a name no one recognized. And worst of all, a thin spiral notebook, handwritten cover. Temptation cases, personal log. The sergeant's voice was barely a whisper. Jesus Christ. Matthew's fists clenched. Daniel felt like the roof had collapsed on him. Elias had kept notes, records, logs, of boys, of moments, of sins he believed he was correcting. Open it, Matthew said quietly. The officer flipped it open, page after page. Dates, times, initials, descriptions. Not of church teachings, not of counseling, of encounters, of discipline sessions, of spiritual realignments, of private correction times with boys between ages 13 and 19. Some entries had stars beside them. Some names were crossed out. One note read, D resisted again today. Confusion still strong in him. Will require firmer intervention. Daniel's breath hitched. That was him. He stumbled back, gripping a pew to stay upright. Matthew stepped toward him instantly. Danny? No. Daniel shook his head, voice trembling. He wrote about me. Like I was something to fix. Matthew swallowed hard. He did this to all of them. The officer turned the page again. A new entry, highlighted, dated the same evening as the attack. Confronted me behind the church. Must reinforce my authority. He is too old now, but there are younger ones who still need correction. The initials of the young man Matthew saw earlier. The same one who ran. The same one begging Elias to stop. But it was the handkerchief that pulled Daniel's attention next. A name embroidered in the corner. Jonah. Do we have any Jonah in the church records? An officer asked. One officer tapped on the tablet connected to the church database. Sir, he murmured, face going pale. There was a Jonah. Was? He nodded. He disappeared 3 years ago. Case went cold. The room went still. Daniel stared at the handkerchief as if it were radioactive. What was it doing in Elias's bag? Daniel whispered. Matthew's eyes hardened. Because he never stopped. Another officer lifted the camera gingerly. Battery's low, but I think I can power it on. The screen flickered, then lit up. One video file. No title. Just a date. Yesterday. The sergeant swallowed, then nodded. Play it. The footage loaded. The camera seemed to be hidden, angled toward the confession booth. A young boy, maybe 14, sat nervously in the shadows. A door opened. Footsteps. And then Father Elias's voice. Close the door. Let's begin your correction. Daniel covered his mouth. Tears filled his eyes. Rage, disgust, horror colliding all at once. The sergeant snapped, turn it off. The screen went dark. But the echo of Elias's voice lingered like poison in the room. This is no longer an assault investigation, the sergeant declared. This is a predatory abuse case spanning years, maybe decades. And Daniel? Another officer asked softly. Matthew answered. He didn't attack a holy man. He attacked his abuser. The sergeant nodded slowly. And maybe, the only reason this evidence even exists is because Daniel fought back. Daniel sank into the pew. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt sick, angry, grief-stricken. Where is the boy from earlier? Daniel whispered. The one Elias grabbed behind the church? Matthew shook his head. Gone. Still missing. The sergeant zipped up the evidence bag. We find him next. He looked at Matthew and Daniel. And we find out how many more there are. In the distance, thunder cracked. As if the sky itself had finally decided to speak. Lightning split the sky as Matthew and the officers guided Jesse out of the tunnel. The storm had turned savage. Wind roaring, rain hitting hard enough to sting skin. But nothing outside matched the storm inside the team. Because Jesse's words replayed in Matthew's mind like a warning bell. He said Jonah never left. He said Jonah is still here. Somewhere only he knows. The sergeant met Matthew halfway across the parking lot. You found him? Matthew nodded. He's safe. Shaken but safe. But the sergeant could see the weight in Matthew's eyes. What else? Matthew hesitated only a second. Elias may have hidden Jonah's body somewhere in the church. The sergeant's whole posture shifted. Straightened, tightened, went deadly focused. Inside the church? You're sure? He said, somewhere only he knows. That's not the woods. That's not the town. That's here. And given Elias's patterns. Matthew shook his head. This fits. The sergeant exhaled hard. All right. We search every room, every crawl space, every forgotten corner. He pointed toward the church. "Let's find Jonah." Officers entered the church like a tactical unit. Flashlights swept through. The altar, the sacristy, storage rooms, the choir loft, the offices, the basement. But it was Daniel, still sitting in the back pew trying to process the truth, who whispered, "There's one place you haven't checked." Matthew approached him quietly. "Where?" Daniel looked toward the front of the church, toward a small wooden door most parishioners barely noticed. It was old, dusty, locked decades ago. "The old prayer chamber," Daniel said. "The one only priests used. I saw Elias go in there as a child, but no one else ever did." Matthew's pulse jumped. The sergeant nodded immediately. "Open it." The wooden door groaned as officers forced it open. A blast of cold, stale air drifted out. Matthew coughed. The room smelled like damp stone and forgotten secrets. Flashlights illuminated a narrow staircase spiraling downward. "Jesus," Ramirez muttered. "How far does this go?" Matthew stepped forward. "There's only one way to find out." He descended first. Every footstep echoed like a warning. Down below, the air got colder, heavier. What? The staircase ended in a stone room no larger than a storage closet. But on the far wall was something that made Matthew stop breathing. A wooden panel. Warped, with scratch marks all over it. Deep ones, human ones. And on the floor, half buried under a rotted piece of cloth, was a bracelet. Small, beaded, with a name spelled out. Jonah. Matthew whispered, "Oh God." But then Ramirez's voice trembled behind him. "There's something else." Behind the scratch panel was a latch, rusty. Matthew reached out, heart pounding. He pulled. The panel swung open, and the smell hit them like a physical slap. "Back up," one officer yelled, covering his nose. Ramirez gagged. The sergeant stepped in, jaw clenched like iron. Inside the compartment, shallow, narrow, dug crudely into the stone, were skeletal remains, small, positioned in a way that made it clear. This was no burial. This was confinement, a place someone had been put, alive, and left. Ramirez whispered, voice cracking, "Jonah." Daniel, who had followed to the doorway, gasped. His hands trembled violently. "He didn't run away," Daniel whispered. "He never ran away." Matthew swallowed painfully. "No. Elias made sure he never could." As the sergeant radioed in the discovery, Matthew noticed something else wedged in the compartment. A piece of paper, yellowed, fragile, crumpled around the edges. He carefully unfolded it. It was handwritten, childlike, desperate. "If anyone finds this, my name is Jonah. Please tell my mom I didn't leave her. I didn't run. He locked me in here. He said God wants me to stay. But I know God wouldn't." Daniel broke. He sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "That could have been me," he whispered. "God, that could have been me." Matthew put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "But you survived. And now, Jonah's finally found." For the first time all night, the storm outside quieted. The wind stopped. The rain softened, almost as if the sky itself had been holding its breath, until Jonah's secret was uncovered. Officers stepped back from the compartment, their expressions a mix of horror and grief. The sergeant spoke, voice low and full of finality. "This is no longer just abuse. This is kidnapping, imprisonment, and homicide." He exhaled slowly. "Reverend Elias is facing charges he will never walk away from." Daniel wiped his face. "Good," he whispered. "For Jonah." Matthew nodded. "For every boy he ever hurt." The courthouse was overflowing, not with curiosity, but with anger, grief, and a community finally waking from a decades-long nightmare. 2 police vans pulled up to the back entrance. Inside the first one sat Daniel, hands shaking, breath unsteady. Inside the second, Reverend Elias. He stepped out in handcuffs, wearing the same calm, self-righteous expression he'd carried the night of the attack. But this time, the world wasn't convinced by his holiness. This time, he wasn't the shepherd. He was the wolf, and everyone finally knew. When Elias entered, the entire room went still. Mothers clutched their children closer. Former parishioners stared at him like he was a ghost. And in the front row sat Jonah's mother, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. Matthew leaned toward the sergeant. "She wanted to be here. She deserves to be," the sergeant replied. Across the aisle, Elias's defense attorney whispered something to him, but Elias didn't respond. He kept his eyes forward, unblinking. emotionless, almost detached from humanity. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Then came the moment that broke the room open. Reverend Elias Morrow, you are charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, aggravated assault, abuse of authority, obstruction of justice, endangering a minor, and multiple counts of long-term coercion and psychological harm. Each charge hit like a hammer. With every word, Jonah's mother trembled harder. Elias stood motionless, face blank, like these were accusations made against someone else. Matthew watched as Daniel was called forward. The room held its breath. Daniel's steps were shaky, but his voice, when he finally spoke, had a strength no one expected. I grew up trusting Reverend Elias, he began. He told me my thoughts were sinful, my feelings were dangerous, and that God wanted me to stay silent. And I believed him. He swallowed hard. But Jonah didn't run away. He didn't vanish. He didn't abandon anyone. He was trapped, just like I was, just like others were. Elias finally looked up, but not with remorse, with irritation, as though Daniel speaking the truth was inconveniencing him. That tiny reaction told the jury everything they needed. Then came the photographs, the bracelet, the scratch marks, the hidden chamber, the note Jonah wrote with shaking hands in the dark. Gasps filled the room. Some people cried openly. One of the jurors covered her mouth, tears spilling. Even the judge paused, longer than usual, as if forcing himself to maintain composure. Against his lawyer's advice, Elias insisted on testifying. He walked to the stand, with a slow, practiced calm. Reverend, the prosecutor started, did you imprison Jonah? Elias smiled faintly. I guided him, he said, to purity. Gasps erupted. The prosecutor stepped closer. You guided him by locking him underground to die? Elias's voice didn't waver. Sacrifice is part of faith. The jury recoiled. Even his own attorney ran a hand down his face. Then the prosecutor delivered the final blow. And assaulting Daniel last night? Was that also guidance? Elias answered, yes. He needed correction. That was it. That was the moment the trial ended emotionally, even before the legal conclusion. The room no longer saw a priest. They saw a predator who believed he was holy. After only 42 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned. On all counts, we find the defendant guilty. Jonah's mother collapsed into Matthew's arms, sobbing. Daniel cried silently in the front row. Officers surrounded Elias and led him away. For the first time, Elias lost the calm mask. He looked confused, then angry, then terrified, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. He was just another criminal being taken where he belonged. As the courtroom emptied, Matthew stepped outside. The sun was setting, a soft orange glow over the town. Daniel joined him. Do you think Jonah can finally rest now? Daniel asked quietly. Matthew nodded. Yes, because the truth is out. He's not forgotten anymore. Daniel wiped his eyes. And Elias? Matthew looked toward the jail vans. He'll spend the rest of his life behind bars. But Jonah finally gets to go home. The cemetery was quiet when Matthew arrived. Just the soft breeze moving through the trees, and the low hum of cicadas settling into the evening. A small crowd had gathered. Not large, not loud, but present. For Jonah. For the first time in years, his name wasn't whispered in fear, or spoken in anger. It was spoken with love. There, beneath a freshly placed headstone, was finally a place for Jonah's mother to kneel. A place she begged for, prayed for, cried for. Daniel approached slowly, holding a single white lily. He placed it on the grave, and whispered something no one else could hear. Then he stepped back, breathing shakily, not from grief alone, but from relief, because the boy he once envied, the boy he once feared, the boy who vanished, was finally found, and no longer suffering. Matthew cleared his throat, addressing the group gathered around. Jonah wasn't lost, he said softly. He was taken, and he was silenced. But today, we give him back his voice. Jonah's mother reached for Daniel's hand. He held it gently, comfortingly. Matthew continued, we come here not to mourn a tragedy, but to honor a child who deserved so much better, who deserved love, who deserved safety, who deserved truth. His voice shook. And because of your courage, he added, looking at Daniel, Jonah is finally home. Daniel blinked through tears, lowering his head. After the small service, Daniel lingered beside Jonah's headstone. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "For being quiet. For being scared. For surviving when you didn't." Matthew stepped beside him. "You survived," he said gently. "To tell the story Jonah couldn't." Daniel didn't answer for a moment, but then he nodded. A slow, steady acknowledgement. "I'm done hiding," he said. "I'm done being afraid of who I am, of who he made me think I was." Matthew smiled. That's what Jonah would want. For the first time in a long time, Daniel's shoulders lifted, as if a massive weight had finally been put down. Across town, Reverend Elias sat alone in a concrete cell. No hymns, no congregation, no titles, just echoing walls and a small, scratched window. He muttered prayers under his breath, but they no longer sounded divine. They sounded desperate. Elias reached for the bars, gripping them tightly. He expected someone, anyone, to come, to seek guidance, to fear him, to need him. But no one came, because his power wasn't holy. It was stolen, built on fear, obedience, and manipulation. And now, it was gone. Forever. Over the next weeks, the church opened its doors again. Not for Elias, but for healing. Therapists volunteered time. Support groups formed. Parents spoke openly about topics once buried in silence. And Daniel, quiet, frightened Daniel, became one of the strongest voices. He spoke at the youth group, at community nights, even at city meetings. "What happened to me," he said, "happened because everyone was afraid to question a man who seemed holy." He looked around the room. Never again. And for the first time, the community believed it. One evening, weeks after the trial, Matthew arrived home to find an envelope taped to his door. No return address. No name. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, written in tight handwriting, "Jonah wasn't the only one. Look deeper. This town hides more than you think." Matthew froze, heart hammering. The case was closed. Elias was gone. Justice had finally been served.